My name is Emily Parker, a 32-year-old high school English teacher in Chicago, and until that night, I had believed my life was finally falling into place. For months, I had poured every spare dollar and ounce of energy into planning the perfect June ceremony at a historic church on the north side. I had chosen white lilies because they were my mother's favorite ivory lace, because it reminded me of my grandmother's gown, and a string quartet, because Michael once told me he loved the sound of violins at dusk. Michael Carter was 34, a financial consultant, with the kind of polish that impressed everyone he met. My parents admired him instantly, calling him dependable, ambitious a man who would take care of me. My younger sister Lily, only 26 and freshly graduated from college, seemed to admire him too. She had the kind of effortless charm that always drew attention, the sparkle in her laugh that made rooms bend toward her. Since childhood, she had been our parents' favorite, and though I never said it aloud, I often felt invisible standing next to her. Still, I told myself none of that mattered. I was the one he had chosen. I was the one who would walk down the aisle, my father at my side, our family gathered the future opening like a promise. That belief carried me through late nights, grading essays, through bills and exhaustion, through the weight of being the older daughter expected to have it all together. But now, with the dress hanging untouched in my closet and silence stretching between every breath, the perfection I had built was cracking. The week before my wedding was not unfolding as I had dreamed. It was unraveling, and deep inside I felt the first cold edge of a truth I was not ready to face. By the second night, I had called him 99 times. I remember staring at the red digits on my phone screen, my thumb trembling as I pressed call again and again. Then, just before midnight, as rain tapped against the window, a message arrived. "Stop calling. I am with Lily now." I froze. The words blurred as though my eyes refused to accept them. For a moment, I thought it was a cruel joke, maybe a hack. I read it again. The number was Michael's. The message was simple, deliberate, final. My knees gave way, and I sat on the floor clutching the phone, hearing the echo of my own breath in the empty room. I drove to my parents' house in Oak Park without thinking, windshield wipers slapping hard against the storm. The lights were on, and through the window I could see them sitting together. When I opened the door, my mother looked startled, then weary, as if she had been expecting this moment. My father avoided my eyes. I asked if they had heard from Michael. Silence. Then my mother sighed and said softly that maybe it was for the best, that I was strong enough to handle it. My father muttered something about Lily being young and confused, that we should not judge her too harshly. It was like the air had been sucked out of the room. They knew. They had known, and said nothing. I felt the ground tilt beneath me. I asked how long. My mother did not answer. My father finally admitted he had seen them together the week before, and had hoped it would blow over. The betrayal of silence was heavier than the betrayal itself. I stared at them, feeling like a stranger in my own family's living room. Memories flooded back, sharp and unwelcome. Every Christmas when Lily got the larger gift, every family dinner, when my achievements were brushed aside while hers were praised. The time I won a citywide essay competition, and my mother forgot to come to the ceremony because Lily had a ballet recital. I thought I had grown past that jealousy, built a life where I mattered. Yet here it was again, the same imbalance. But now it had cost me the man I was about to marry. I left the house without another word. The night air was thick with rain, and the streetlights blurred through my tears. Driving back to my apartment, I kept replaying the message in my head. "Stop calling. I am with Lily now." My heart pounded like a drum in my chest. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Everything I had built, every dream of that June morning in the church, had collapsed in a single sentence. Back in my apartment, the silence was suffocating. The dress hung by the window, ivory fabric glowing faintly under the street lamp outside. The invitation cards were stacked neatly on the counter, each one a reminder of a future that had vanished overnight. I sat at the table, phone still in my hand, staring at the message again. The betrayal was raw, but beneath it a deeper ache spread. It was not just losing Michael. It was realizing my own family had let me walk blind into heartbreak. The weight of that truth pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. I hardly slept that night. My body felt heavy, as if grief had settled into my bones. The next morning, I drove back to my parents' house, hoping for comfort or at least answers. The kitchen smelled of coffee and toasted bread, yet the warmth that usually wrapped around me was gone. My mother stood by the sink, rinsing dishes, her shoulders tense. My father sat at the table reading the paper, though I could tell his eyes weren't moving across the page. I asked them how long they had known. My mother set down a plate too quickly, and it clattered against the counter. She sighed and told me that Lily was young, that people make mistakes, that I should not be too harsh. My father lowered the paper and admitted quietly that Michael had come to him months earlier, asking him to sign a financial guarantee for Lily. He said it was small, nothing to worry about, just a way to help her start out. The words made my stomach turn. Not only had they stayed silent, they had also enabled it. I left their house more hollow than before, but the world outside refused to let me grieve in private. By midweek, photos of Lily and Michael appeared on Instagram. They were at a rooftop bar in downtown Chicago, smiling as though nothing was broken, glasses of champagne raised high. Friends tagged them with hearts and congratulations. At school, I heard two teachers whisper near the copier, their voices dropping when I walked past. Even at the grocery store, an old neighbor stopped me to ask gently if it was true. The shame was worse than heartbreak. It felt like everyone knew my private humiliation. Each glance carried pity, curiosity, or barely hidden judgment. I avoided eye contact, buried myself in lesson plans, and came home each night to sit in silence. By Friday, my parents insisted on a family dinner, perhaps, to pretend we were still united. I agreed, though dread knotted my stomach. We gathered around the oak table in the dining room, the same table where birthdays and holidays had once been celebrated. The air was thick, words sparse. I barely touched the roast chicken on my plate. Then my father broke the silence. He said at least Lily had chosen a man with ambition, someone successful. The words sliced deeper than any knife. My fork slipped from my hand and clattered against the china. My mother glanced at me but said nothing. The message was clear. In their eyes, I was the disappointment, and Lily was still their shining daughter. I excused myself and left before dessert. The drive back to my apartment blurred city lights, streaking across the windshield like smears of judgment. My chest ached with fury and grief, but underneath a flicker of defiance began to stir. 2 days later, Lily showed up at my apartment uninvited. She carried a garment bag and walked in with that same air of entitlement she had worn since childhood. She unzipped the bag and pulled out my wedding dress, the ivory silk glowing under the dim light. She held it up and smiled. "This looks better on me anyway." Her voice dripped with mockery. I could not speak. Tears burned behind my eyes. I pressed my palms against the counter to steady myself as she tossed the bag onto the sofa and walked out, leaving the dress crumpled, like it was nothing. When the door slammed, I collapsed to the floor and sobbed until my throat was raw. That night, I cried myself empty, every breath hitching like a wound that refused to close. But in the stillness afterward, when the tears finally dried, memories surfaced. Times I had caught Lily borrowing money secretly from my parents, the way she always lived, just beyond her means. I remembered Michael once mentioning the pressure of finances, his voice tight, almost resentful. The pieces started to form a shape I had not seen before. Maybe this was not only betrayal of love. Maybe there was something deeper tangled with money and lies. The thought unsettled me, but it also gave me a strange kind of focus. My pain was real, but so was the sense that this story was far from over. I stared at the crumpled dress on the couch, the fabric shimmering faintly under the streetlight outside. For the first time since everything collapsed, I felt a shift inside me. What if their betrayal was only the surface? What if beneath it was a truth they had hoped I would never uncover? The following week at school, as I was grading essays during my lunch break, the secretary walked into my classroom with a small padded envelope. No return address, just my name typed neatly on the front. I frowned, turning it over in my hands. It was heavier than it looked. Curiosity nudged me past hesitation, and I tore it open. Inside was a stack of photocopied documents. At first I thought it was some mistake, maybe paperwork sent to the wrong Emily Parker. But then I saw the names. Michael Carter, borrower. Lily Parker, co-signer. My heart pounded as I scanned the header. Bank of Illinois. Loan amount $75,000. I gripped the edge of my desk. Why would Lily sign with him? Why would Michael even need this? The more I looked, the more the pages blurred until one detail snapped me back. A signature line. My father's handwriting neat and careful, placed as a guarantor. I dropped the papers, my hands suddenly cold. After the last bell rang, I called Maggie. She had been my closest friend since college, now 33, and grinding through her final year of law school in Milwaukee. She picked up on the second ring, her voice steady as always. I told her about the envelope. She asked me to drive up that evening. By dusk, I was sitting in her apartment, the papers spread across her dining table. Maggie read each page slowly, her brow furrowing deeper with every line. Finally, she leaned back. "Michael has a history," she said quietly. "I did some digging after you called. He was terminated from his firm last year. Not officially disclosed, but the whispers were about fraudulent reports. And there are rumors of gambling debts, serious ones." Her words cut through the air. My stomach churned. Maggie slid another printout toward me, one she had pulled up from a public record search. It showed liens and judgments tied to Michael's name, some linked to questionable accounts. And then she added something that made me shiver. There are also connections to shell companies in New Jersey. It looks like money laundering fronts. I pressed my palms against my thighs, trying to ground myself. Lily had not just stolen my fiancé. She had walked straight into a trap of debt and crime, and my father had unknowingly signed his name onto it. I whispered that out loud, and Maggie nodded grimly. She tapped one of the signatures. "And Emily, look here." She flipped another page. "This signature isn't your father's. It's meant to be yours." My breath caught. I stared at the scrawl. It was close but too stiff, like someone had practiced copying me. Maggie folded her arms. "If this is what I think it is, Lily forged your name. That means if the loan goes bad, the bank could come after you too." The room tilted. For days I had been drowning in betrayal, but now I realized the danger was larger than my broken heart. I could lose everything, not because of love, but because of fraud. Maggie reached across the table, her voice steady. "We need to treat this seriously. You are not just a victim of infidelity. You are potentially implicated in a financial crime. Do not confront them yet. Collect everything. Keep records and let me check further." I nodded, though my mind reeled. Images of Lily asking for money as a teenager. Michael's irritation whenever bills came up. My father's blind faith in his youngest child. All of it swirled together until it formed a single picture. This was not an accident. They had all played roles, whether through deception or silence. And now my name was on paper I had never signed. Driving back that night, Chicago's skyline glowed against the dark lake. My hands tightened on the wheel. I thought of the wedding invitations stacked uselessly in my apartment, the ivory dress still draped across the couch. They were symbols of a life I had lost. But the documents in my bag represented something worse. A trap I had not even known I was walking into. By the time I pulled into my driveway, a new emotion had taken root beneath the grief. Fear, yes, but also a fierce determination. If they thought I would stay silent, they were wrong. For the first time since the night of that message, I felt a spark of control returning. I locked the papers in a drawer, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my notebook. I began writing down everything I remembered, every suspicious comment, every time Michael avoided a question about money, every instance Lily had begged or borrowed. The pen scratched against the paper, steady and sharp. Betrayal had broken me, but these documents had given me something else. A reason to fight. And as I closed the notebook, I knew this was only the beginning. The truth was deeper and darker than I had feared, and I had just touched the edge of it. On the morning I should have been putting on my wedding dress, I walked through the marble doors of the Cook County Courthouse with a folder clutched to my chest. The church bells downtown rang faintly in the distance, but instead of bridesmaids and flowers, I was surrounded by attorneys in gray suits and clerks shuffling papers. My hands trembled as I handed the clerk my petition, a request for legal protection against fraudulent liabilities tied to my name. She stamped the papers without a flicker of emotion. For her, it was routine. For me, it was the death certificate of the life I had imagined. I left the courthouse and sat in my car staring at the steering wheel. Somewhere across town, guests were arriving at St. Paul's Church expecting vows and music. Instead, Lily and Michael had arranged a private reception at a downtown loft, a place with exposed brick and string lights that once I had helped pick out for an engagement party. I tried not to picture them standing there, as if nothing had been broken. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with notifications. A video spread like wildfire across Facebook and Instagram. In the shaky footage, two men in worn jackets stormed into the loft shouting Michael's name. Their voices echoed over clinking glasses. They held up papers demanding repayment for debts. One guest tried to intervene, but the men kept shouting, calling him a liar, a thief. The camera caught Lily's pale face, her glass slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor. The video ended with Michael backing away, eyes darting like a cornered animal. I sat frozen on my couch as comments poured in. Some called it karma. Others speculated about how deep the debt went. My stomach churned. Shame for my family mixed with a sharp sense of vindication. At least now the world could see that I had not been the fool. That night, as rain drummed against the windows, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, but something compelled me to answer. The voice on the other end was steady, older, carrying the weight of experience. She introduced herself as Linda Hayes, 48, from Newark. She said she had once trusted Michael, too. He had promised her an investment opportunity, something clean and secure. She lost over $50,000 before realizing it was a lie. I held the phone tighter. She said she had been the one who mailed me the documents. She had found my address after hearing rumors that Michael was marrying into a respectable family in Chicago. She wanted me to see the truth before it was too late. My chest tightened as she spoke. It was strange hearing the voice of another victim, someone whose pain echoed mine, but in a different form. Linda went on explaining that she had traced some of the money through accounts tied to shell corporations in New Jersey. She believed they were fronts for laundering. She had contacts documents, pieces of the puzzle I could never have gathered alone. She said she wanted to help not out of pity, but because she refused to let him keep ruining lives. I closed my eyes and listened to her words. For the first time since everything collapsed, I did not feel completely alone. My instinct was to pull back to protect myself from further betrayal. But I heard the conviction in her voice. She had nothing to gain by calling me. She simply wanted justice. I told her I was scared, that my own sister was entangled, that my father's name was on some of the papers, that I felt trapped between loyalty and survival. Linda was quiet for a moment, then said softly that loyalty had limits when it destroyed you. She reminded me that my name had been forged, that silence could cost me my future. We agreed to meet later that week. I promised to bring what I had, and she would bring her files. After we hung up, I sat in the dim light of my apartment, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. The dress still lay crumpled on the couch, but beside it now was my notebook filled with observations and the envelope of documents. A strange calm settled over me. I knew I was stepping into a fight I had never wanted. Yet for the first time I had an ally, someone who had seen Michael's mask slip long before I did. Outside, the city quieted after the storm. I drew the curtains and locked the door, clutching the envelope against my chest. The betrayal had broken me, but with Linda's call, a new chapter had begun. I was no longer the abandoned bride. I was a woman preparing for battle, and the evidence was finally on my side. Within a week, Linda and I were meeting regularly in coffee shops and libraries, our tables covered with folders and laptops. She had a binder thick with statements and screenshots, each page tracing the path of Michael's lies. I brought my own notebook and the photocopies I had received. Together we pieced the puzzle, highlighting connections between casino withdrawals, late-night wire transfers, and accounts that existed only on paper. One afternoon in a quiet corner of the Harold Washington Library, Linda slid across a photograph taken by a private investigator she still had on retainer. Michael at a casino in Gary, Indiana, chips stacked high, grinning at the dealer. My stomach nodded. He looked so carefree, the same smile he once used to convince me he loved me. I forced myself to look harder, noting the dates, the amounts he withdrew that night. It matched a suspicious transaction in one of the bank statements. Proof layered upon proof. The more I learned, the less I recognized the man I had planned to marry. Linda spoke about him clinically like a case file, but I still felt the sting of betrayal every time his name appeared in black ink. It was exhausting, yet strangely empowering. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting. I was building a case. News reached me through a cousin that Lily had stopped posting pictures with Michael. Then came whispers that she had caught him with another woman, someone older, someone with money of her own. I didn't want to believe it, but the rumor spread quickly. Soon after, I saw it with my own eyes. A photo circulated online of Michael stepping out of a downtown hotel, his arm draped casually around a brunette in a red coat. Lily was nowhere in sight. That image must have broken whatever fantasy she had left. A few nights later, there was a knock on my apartment door. I opened it to find Lily standing there, her face streaked with mascara, her hair tangled like she had been pulling at it. She clutched her purse as if it was the only solid thing left. She asked if she could come in. I let her. We sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where I had cried alone weeks earlier. Her hands shook as she spoke. She said she was trapped, that Michael had convinced her to sign papers she didn't understand, that she had believed he loved her. Her voice cracked as she admitted she had seen messages on his phone, proof that she was not the only one. I listened, my heart caught between anger and pity. I stood and pulled a sheet from my drawer, the copy of the loan agreement with my forged signature. I placed it in front of her. She stared at it, then at me. Tears welled in her eyes. She whispered that Michael told her it was the only way to keep everything from collapsing, that he promised he would fix it. She admitted she had traced my signature herself, her hands trembling as she said it. I felt heat rise in my chest, fury mixing with relief. At last, she said the words out loud. I didn't forgive her, not then. But I saw the raw desperation in her eyes. She was broken, too manipulated, just as I had been, though she had chosen to carry out his schemes. I told her I would not protect her from the consequences, but if she wanted any chance at redemption, she had to help me uncover everything. She nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand. For once, she did not argue. She pulled from her purse a crumpled slip of paper with account numbers Michael had hidden, numbers she had copied down before leaving his apartment. When she left that night, the apartment felt heavy with the scent of her perfume and despair. I sank into the couch, staring at the dress still draped there now, half hidden by stacks of documents. The dress looked less like a memory, and more like evidence itself, a relic of a life that never existed. I picked up the slip of paper Lily had given me and tucked it into the folder with Linda's files. The betrayal had torn me apart, but this cooperation, fragile as it was, shifted the balance. I was no longer simply the one left behind. I had allies, I had proof, and for the first time, I had control. The fight ahead was enormous, but the tide was turning. Somewhere across the city, Michael was still smiling, still pretending he held all the cards. He had no idea that the people he once deceived were beginning to align against him. And as I turned off the kitchen light that night, the thought of what was coming settled over me like a promise. 6 months later, I found myself standing outside the courthouse in downtown Chicago, clutching a folder so full of documents that the edges pressed lines into my palms. The air was sharp with early winter, and my breath clouded as I walked up the stone steps. Reporters lingered near the entrance, their voices buzzing, as they speculated about the case. I pulled my coat tighter and tried to keep my head down. Inside the wood-paneled courtroom smelled faintly of polish and paper. My stomach knotted as I took a seat behind my attorney. Across the aisle, Michael sat at the defendant's table, his suit crisp but his face drawn. Lily was beside him, pale and restless, her fingers tapping against her knee. My parents sat behind them. My mother's lips pressed tight. my father staring at the floor as if hoping it would swallow him. The judge entered, and the first hearing of the civil case began. My attorney rose and presented the forged loan documents highlighting the signature that was meant to be mine. He laid out the copies of Michael's gambling debts, the suspicious transfers. Linda and I had tracked the mounting evidence of deception. My heart pounded as each piece was read into the record. It was no longer just whispers in my notebook. It was official, inked into the language of the court. Michael's attorney responded quickly, pointing to Lily. He claimed that she had orchestrated the entire scheme, that Michael had simply trusted the wrong person. He painted himself as a victim dragged down by a reckless young woman. My throat burned as I listened to him twist the truth. When it was Lily's turn, she shifted uncomfortably and told the court that I had fabricated the story because I could not stand to see her happy. She said I was jealous, that I had always resented her. Her voice cracked, but she pressed on, even daring to say that I had planted the idea of investments in Michael's mind years earlier. My fists clenched at my sides. The judge called my father to the stand. He walked slowly, shoulders heavy, as if carrying decades of silence. The attorney asked about his signature on one of the financial guarantees. My father cleared his throat, his voice hoarse, as he admitted he had signed because Lily asked. He said Michael promised him it was safe, that the debt would be temporary. He confessed he never read the details. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. For years I had suspected his blind faith in Lily, but hearing it aloud was like watching the last pillar of our family collapse. Reporters scribbled furiously. By evening, the headlines would read, "Bride-to-be exposes family fraud, Chicago family in scandal." I could already imagine my students' parents reading it over breakfast, neighbors whispering at the grocery store. The shame clung to me, but so did a grim pride. The truth was finally out, even if it dragged us all into the mud. When court recessed, I stepped into the hallway where cameras flashed in my face. Questions flew, each sharper than the last. Was I seeking revenge? Did I want my sister imprisoned? Was this about money or jealousy? I kept walking, my heels clicking against the marble, my jaw tight. My attorney shielded me from the worst of it, but I felt every word like a stone. That night, alone in my apartment, I read the online articles. Some praised my courage, others accused me of destroying my own family. I sat at the table where Lily had once begged for help, the dress still stuffed into its bag in the closet, and tried to breathe past the noise. 2 days later, the judge summoned me formally. I was to be the key witness, the one to testify under oath about everything I had uncovered. My parents' faces flashed through my mind, the way my mother had looked away when Michael's lies were laid bare, the way my father admitted his part. My hands trembled as I signed the subpoena. The path was clear. I would stand before the court, before my family, before strangers and cameras, and tell the story from the beginning. I would describe the message that shattered my wedding, the documents that arrived in an unmarked envelope, the night spent with Linda, tracing every dollar. The thought terrified me, but beneath the fear there was a steady resolve. I had been humiliated, betrayed, and nearly ruined, yet here I was with evidence that could bring the truth into the light. As I closed the folder and set it on my desk, the city lights blinked outside my window. The fight was only beginning, and I knew the next step would be the most brutal of all. The morning of the final hearing dawned gray and cold. I stood outside the courthouse once again, this time surrounded by news vans and microphones. Reporters shouted my name as I walked up the steps, but I kept my eyes forward, clutching the folder of exhibits my attorney had prepared. My heart beat so fast it felt like it was rattling in my ribs. Inside the courtroom, the air buzzed with tension. Michael sat at the defense table, his jaw tight, his eyes darting nervously. Lily sat beside him, mascara smudged, her hands twisting the hem of her skirt. My parents were behind them. My mother staring at me with a look that was half sorrow, half accusation. My father avoided my eyes completely. When the judge called me to the stand, my knees shook as I rose. I swore to tell the truth and settled into the chair, clutching the microphone. My attorney guided me gently through my testimony. I laid out the forged signatures, explained how the documents had arrived in that anonymous envelope, and described the hours I spent tracing bank records with Linda. Screens lit up with slides of the loan agreements, the mismatched handwriting, the photographs from the casino in Indiana. The defense tried to rattle me, suggesting I had held a grudge that my heartbreak made me fabricate. I steadied my voice and said I wished none of this were true, but the evidence was right in front of us. I turned my eyes toward Michael, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Then Linda took the stand. She spoke clearly about the money she had lost, about the shell corporations she had traced in New Jersey. Her testimony was measured, unemotional, but powerful. When she handed over copies of wire transfers and emails, I saw the jury's eyes widen. It was Lily's turn. She broke down almost instantly, tears streaming, as she said, "I had always hated her, that I had set her up to fall." She claimed I wanted revenge. Her voice cracked as she said I could not stand to see her happy. I forced myself to stay still, though her words sliced through me. The judge asked her about the forged signature. She hesitated too long, then said Michael told her it was the only way to save their future. The courtroom murmured. The prosecution produced its final blow. Bank investigators had uncovered records showing Michael transferring large sums into a construction company in Newark that existed only on paper. It was the same company Linda had suspected months earlier. The prosecutor explained calmly that it was a laundering scheme, money passing through fake invoices before disappearing into offshore accounts. Michael's face drained of color. The room erupted with whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicking. The judge called for order. My chest tightened as I realized this was the moment everything broke open. It was no longer about jealousy or betrayal. It was fraud, conspiracy, crime on a scale none of us had imagined when this began. After closing arguments, the jury left to deliberate. I sat outside in the hallway, my hands cold despite the heat blasting through the vents. Hours passed, each one stretching like a year. When the bailiff finally called us back, my legs felt heavy. The verdict was read quickly. Guilty on multiple counts of fraud and money laundering, Michael Carter was sentenced to federal prison. My sister was found complicit in the forgeries, but spared jail time in exchange for cooperation. She received probation and financial restitution orders that would bankrupt her. My father's signature was acknowledged as negligent, but not criminal, though his reputation was destroyed. My mother wept silently, clutching her purse. I walked out of the courthouse into a wall of flashing lights. Reporters shouted questions, but their words blurred into noise. My attorney guided me through the crowd. I felt strangely light and unbearably heavy at the same time. Justice had been served, but my family lay in ruins. That night, I sat at my desk with the window open, the city alive with honking horns and neon lights. My inbox pinged with a new message. It was from an academic organization in New York, inviting me to speak at a conference on financial abuse within families. I stared at the screen, my hand hovering over the mouse. The idea of standing before strangers and recounting this story again felt impossible. Yet something inside me stirred the faintest sense that maybe my pain could mean more than survival. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, listening to the hum of traffic. The trial was over, but the weight of what came next pressed against me like a question waiting for an answer. I packed my life into boxes and boarded a train to New York before the winter ended. The city greeted me with the kind of noise that rattled your chest, sirens echoing down narrow streets, steam rising from grates, a constant hum that never let you forget you were alive. I rented a small apartment in Queens, just big enough for a bed, a desk, and the stack of files I still carried like scars. Within weeks, I started working at a nonprofit that supported women facing financial abuse. The office was tucked above a deli in Brooklyn, crowded and warm with posters on the walls reminding women of their rights. My days filled with phone calls from strangers who whispered into the receiver about debts they never agreed to, loans they never signed, accounts that drained their paychecks. Their voices trembled, and I recognized the same fear that had once kept me awake at night. I listened, I guided them to resources, and slowly I felt a purpose grow inside me. One morning, an envelope arrived in my mailbox, the handwriting instantly familiar. I carried it inside and sat at my desk before opening it. The letter was from Lily, written in the uneven script she had as a girl. She said she was in a rehabilitation program instead of prison, that the judge had given her a chance to rebuild her life. She wrote that I had saved her not by protecting her, but by forcing her to face the truth. She admitted she hated me for exposing her, yet in the same breath she said she was grateful, because it might be the only reason she was still alive. She ended by saying she hoped one day I could forgive her. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. Forgiveness was not something I could offer yet, but reading her words softened a part of me that had been hardened too long. It was not peace, but it was the beginning of it. My parents called once in a while. The conversations were brief and awkward, filled with long pauses. My mother said she was sorry, though she never explained exactly for what. My father admitted he had been blind, that his trust in Lily had destroyed more than he ever imagined. They lived quietly now, in our old neighborhood, no longer hosting gatherings, no longer at the center of community events. When I hung up, I often sat staring at the wall, wondering if healing a family was ever truly possible. Spring came, and with it, the conference in Manhattan. I walked into the ballroom of a hotel near Times Square, my heart pounding as I looked at the rows of chairs filled with women, some young, some gray-haired, all waiting to hear stories that might echo their own. The stage lights burned hot against my skin as I stepped up to the podium. For a moment, I saw only darkness beyond the glare, then slowly the outlines of faces came into focus. I told them about the message that shattered my engagement, about the documents that arrived in an envelope without a return address, about the nights spent piecing together evidence with another woman who had been deceived just like me. I spoke of my sister's tears, of my father's confession, of the silence that had nearly drowned me. I told them how justice had come, but not without cost, and how I had rebuilt myself from the ashes. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then applause rose, rolling through the hall, not loud like thunder, but steady like a heartbeat. Women stood, some with tears in their eyes, some nodding, as if I had spoken words they had never dared say aloud. In that moment, the weight I had carried for months lifted just enough for me to breathe freely. Later that evening, as the city glittered outside the hotel windows, I sat alone and let the silence wash over me. My journey had been carved by betrayal, but it had led me to a place where I could turn pain into something useful. Justice was not only the sentence delivered in court, it was the choice to rise, to refuse to be defined by the lies of others, to claim my voice when others tried to silence it. If you have ever been betrayed by the people you trusted most, if you have ever felt the ground pulled from under you, remember this. The truth, your truth, and the strength you hold inside are the sweetest revenge. And if this story resonates with you, stay with me. Share your thoughts. Let your voice be part of this space, because none of us should ever feel we are standing alone.